Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 13, Verb Stems, and more information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 100 to 115. We're going to be making use of the basic 9-cell grid that we had introduced in previous lessons. As we remember, there are 3 rows with their columns. And in the upper left, the pa'al verb stem is very similar to the biblical Hebrew kal. And then that pa'al verb stem has a GP internal passive variant, the pa'il. And that's the passive of the G stem idea. And finally, the TG on the right, the hit pa'el, is the reflexive stem for the G stem idea. The second row, the D row, has to do with the stems that double the middle consonant. There's a missing DP cell right there, which is to say there's not a direct equivalent for the pu'al in Biblical Aramaic. But as we will talk about a little bit more, there are ways that Biblical Aramaic can express the DP idea. So the loss of the pu'al is not a big deal. And then finally, the C row has hafel anchoring it, and it also has the internal passive CP and then the TC variants. There are variations of these major stems that we will encounter in our reading. So we need to expand to discuss these less frequently seen stems. Well, what have I added here? Well, let's start in the upper right. We see in the TG cell that previously only had hit pa'el. Now we see it pa'el. And then in the TD cell, hit pa'al and it pa'al and so forth. Hishtafel, ishtafel. What's happened? Well, these stems, instead of having a hey prefix, have an aleph prefix and are free spelling variants, just as in the lower left, the hafel and the afel. And in a little bit, we're going to see an example, an illustration of how these are free variants of spelling that have the same meaning. So hafel and afel, even sometimes in the same literary context, will both represent the causative of even the same verbal root. Okay, now we're going to expand the chart for these stems. So just as in Biblical Hebrew, there are certain weak verb classes that require alterations to the spelling of stems. And that's the case here. So the polel and the hit polel are used for hollow verbs in Biblical Aramaic. Do you remember the hollow verb category from Biblical Hebrew? That was when there was a vav or a yod in the middle. So when a hollow verb in Biblical Aramaic requires a D-stem verb, it's going to be polel or hit polel. And then the it poel variant just has to do with a geminate verb root that appears with an aleph prefix instead of a hey prefix. Okay? So moving those out of the way, we now need to add one more expansion, and that has to do with the shafel in the causative cell. Now, if we look closely, we'll see the TC cell, hishtafel and ishtafel, have that sheen sound, and they actually are related morphologically with shafel rather than hafel and afel. There's a sheen as the prefix rather than aleph, rather than hey. But shafel is a causative, just like afel and hafel are. Now, other Semitic languages have more shafel verbs than Biblical Aramaic does, but we should just be aware of the shafel as we read, because that also is one of the causatives. So let's take out the free spelling variants except for afel, since we're including shafel, and use this as our basic grid henceforth. All right? So the first special comment I want to make has to do with focusing on the D row, specifically the so-called missing DP cell. All right? So what we've already mentioned about that is that the TD stem, which until now we had only known about the hit pa'al, can express passive voice, just like the other reflexive stems can do in their rows of the 9-member grid. So this is a way that Biblical Hebrew can express the DP concept, is just to use the hit pa'al. So for this reason, there's not a need for a dedicated DP stem. There's another couple ways to express DP. We haven't talked about participles yet, but the pa'el, that is to say the active voice D stem, its participles can have passive meaning. So there's a D and then P in parentheses participle, and we'll see why I use that notation later, that can also express a DP idea. And then finally, there are PA-LD forms with an indefinite plural subject. And what do I mean by that? I mean indefinite or undefined plural subject. So let's look at that. In Ezra 6:1, then Darius the king made a decree, and they searched in the house of the books in which the treasure was kept in Babylon. Well, a search of the immediate context does not turn up a referent for they. And so this isn't the only example, but it's a pa'el example, so that's why I used it to show that in many Bible translations, this is a search was made, because there's not really a they to attach to this they meaning that would be the literalistic rendering of this pa'el-d form in Ezra 6:1. So it's not an exclusively pa'el-d phenomenon. There are other verb stems that have an undefined plural subject where it looks like the most natural reading is passive, because that subject is just not defined. There's no they to attach it to. This can happen in Biblical Hebrew, but it's much more common in Biblical Aramaic to have an undefined subject that reads more naturally as a passive. Now, going back to our 9-cell grid, I'd like just to talk a little bit about some more information about the passive stems. Passive voice. So an idea with passive voice is that agents are demoted or perhaps ultimately deleted. So the most frequently seen case is which there's no agent at all. And we see this in Daniel 6:18. And it was put upon the mouth of the den. So who did this putting? Not specified. But agents can be specified. And so here's a specified, but what I'm calling non-prominent agent. A stone was cut, not by hands. And the way that Biblical Hebrew and many other languages, and Biblical Aramaic here, will express the agent of a passive verb is through use of a preposition. So bait is one of the prepositions that Biblical Aramaic will use to do this. So this is not an object, where the patient has been promoted to subject in passive voice. It's not an object because it's in a prepositional phrase. It's just a reintroduced agent. But because the patient has been promoted to subject, we say the agent is demoted, and the agent is not important here. A stone was cut is an understandable expression. So just reintroducing the agent in Daniel 2:34 is not to say that the by hands is in a syntactically prominent position. Okay? And then finally, it's possible to have a prominent agent even in this strangely demoted situation. So a re-promoted, demoted agent. By Cyrus the king, a decree was put. So there's no doubt that that's a passive voice verb, and it's following the same agent designation system of using a preposition. So why do we say that this is a prominent agent? Well, it's placed before the passive voice verb in that syntactically prominent position. Now, it just so happens in Biblical Aramaic that all of the specified prominent demoted agents for passive voice verbs are in this sort of formula. So it may indeed be that there's not a syntactical prominence that's necessarily intended. So that would be a debatable point, but it's just important from a grammar standpoint first to talk about agents can still be specified in passive voice expressions, and they can even move to the syntactically prominent fronted position. Okay, so I talked about passive. What about reflexive? So let's talk a little bit more about the reflexive stems. There are several possible uses. So there is a true reflexive use that's possible for the reflexive stems. So Daniel 5:23 reads, "You lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven." So that self there is reflecting the reflexive idea in the English translation. There's also an iterative, similar to Biblical Hebrew's use of reflexive stems. From days of old, this city has been rising up against kings. It's something that happens over and over. Okay, so that iteration idea is something that's well at home in our intuition about reflexive stems from Biblical Hebrew. And then finally, as we have mentioned, actually a fairly key role that the reflexive stems play in Biblical Aramaic is to express passive voice. And light and insight and extraordinary wisdom are found in you. All right, so we return to the grid. Now I'd like to talk about the differences in ideas that we see between G, D, and C as we move down these columns. All right, so the G, D, and C stems. We've said before that the G stem is the basic idea. So here is Kof, Vav, Mem. He arose in haste. This is the all-perfect third masculine singular. D, Pa'el infinitive, the king to establish an ordinance. So establishing is a different idea than rising up. So we're seeing a modification of the idea of Kof, Vav, Mem in the D stem. And then here, the causative. He has set or caused to arise over the kingdom. So G and C, that relationship is very clear. There's a causing idea in this dynamic verb. And there is an interesting meaning difference between G and D that would require understanding for Kof, Vav, Mem, what the difference is. So it pays for these verbal roots that have both G and D to try to study the meaning difference between them, because it's a bit less obvious and less systematic than the G and C difference of causing. So we've talked down the various rows in a column kind of way. Next, I want to talk across the row. Okay, so this is an example. G, GP, and TG. So G, all participle masculine singular. He gives wisdom to the wise. Versus, and to him was given. So you see that meaning difference? This is for the yod, hey, bait verb root. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. And finally, a TG stem, and they will be given into his hand. And we notice in this particular case, in the hit pa'el, that this is playing the role of passive. So in this case, semantically speaking, the pa'il in the GP case and the hit pa'el in the TG case are both expressing passive voice. What I want to do on this slide, however, is just to show the same verbal root being expressed in G, GP, and TG. Now, having discussed passive and reflexive, next I want to focus in on the causatives. Stems within the same category, just finally to show that there really is no meaning difference. So I'm calling Aphel the C with A in parentheses to make sure we understand that this is the aleph prefix, not hey prefix, Aphel. And this particular use in Daniel 3:1 is he set it up, and you can see the suffix pronoun there attached on the end. You can also very clearly see the aleph prefix. But then in the very next verse is a hafel, that is to say a C, and then in parentheses H, just to specify that that's a hey prefix, he set up. So same literary context, same meaning, free variance, whether it's an aphel or a hafel. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of a very quick tour through more specific information about the verb stems. Hopefully this will be helpful as we now move on and we apply this information to further and deeper studies of the Biblical Aramaic verbal system.